A single memorandum, signed in 1932, decided which rifle American soldiers would carry into the Second World War nearly a decade before the war began. It was not a combat report. It was not a battlefield assessment. It was a budget decision made by the Army Chief of Staff that had nothing to do with which rifle actually performed better, and everything to do with what the United States government could afford to spend on ammunition during the worst economic collapse in the history of the country. The rifle that lost that memorandum was, by the assessment of a considerable number of ordnance officers who tested it extensively, the more advanced design. It fed faster, it handled a lighter, more efficient cartridge purpose built for the rifle itself, rather than a cartridge inherited from an entirely different era of warfare. It was the product of one of the most respected firearms engineers working for the United States government at the time. His name was John Pedersen, and the rifle was never adopted, not because it failed a test on a range, but because a general with authority over army budgets decided the country couldn't afford to retool its entire ammunition supply chain in the middle of the Great Depression. The rifle that won instead, the M1 Garand, went on to become one of the most celebrated infantry weapons in American history, carried by millions of soldiers across every theater of the Second World War. It might not have been the best rifle available. It was simply the rifle the budget allowed. Tonight, you're going to find out about the rifle that never got the chance to prove General MacArthur wrong, and exactly why he never gave it one. John Pedersen was, by the professional judgment of nearly everyone who worked alongside him, one of the finest firearms designers of his generation. And by the 1920s, he had already built a reputation that few American engineers of the era could match. He had worked closely with John Browning, contributed meaningfully to the development of military ordnance during the First World War, and invented what became known as the Pedersen device, an ingenious conversion mechanism that could transform a standard bolt-action Springfield rifle into a semi-automatic weapon in the field, a device the Army had ordered in significant numbers for a planned 1919 offensive that the armistice ultimately made unnecessary. By the time the Army began seriously pursuing a semi-automatic replacement for the bolt-action Springfield in the 1920s, Pedersen was already recognized as one of the 2 or 3 most credible candidates to design it, and he set to work on a rifle built around a mechanism entirely his own, a toggle locking action distinct from the mechanism John Garand was independently developing at Springfield Armory. Pedersen did something that deserves real credit, and that this channel wants to state plainly before the rest of the story develops. He did not simply design a rifle and force an existing cartridge to work inside it. He designed the rifle and the cartridge together as a single integrated system, built around a .276 caliber round specifically engineered to feed reliably through his toggle lock mechanism while delivering genuinely excellent ballistic performance in a lighter, more compact package than the standard .30-06 the Army had used since 1906. That is the man this story belongs to. Not simply a talented mechanic, but a systems thinker. A designer who understood that a rifle and its cartridge were not separate problems to be solved independently, but a single, unified engineering challenge, and who built accordingly at a level of integrated design sophistication that a considerable number of the ordnance officers who tested his rifle through the late 1920s and early 1930s found genuinely impressive. Extensive trials conducted at Aberdeen and elsewhere through this period tested the Pedersen rifle against the competing Garand had design. And while the historical record on a relative performance across every category is mixed and worth treating with appropriate care rather than false certainty, a meaningful body of contemporary testing opinion favored aspects of the Pedersen system, particularly its cartridge, which many ordnance officers considered a more thoughtfully engineered round for a semi-automatic infantry rifle than the older .30-06, a cartridge originally designed decades earlier for a bolt-action rifle and a very different tactical doctrine. Pedersen was owed a fair trial on the merits, conducted with the same rigor and the same open-mindedness that a genuinely difficult engineering competition deserves. And for years, through the length and expense of the trial's process, he largely got exactly that. The competition between his rifle and the design Garand had was conducted seriously by officers who took the underlying engineering questions seriously, across an extended period of testing and refinement that both designers participated in good faith. What Pedersen was not owed, and what he ultimately received anyway, was a decision made above the level of the engineers and the testing officers entirely, by a general whose primary concern was never which rifle actually performed better on a range, but what the United States Treasury could afford to spend on an entirely new ammunition supply chain during the deepest economic crisis in the history of the country. The man who made the decision that ended the rifle Pedersen had a name, and unlike many of the institutional antagonists this channel has documented, the paper trail behind his decision is relatively clear, even if the full internal reasoning inside his own mind can never be known with certainty. His name was Douglas MacArthur, and in 1932 he held the position of Army Chief of Staff, the most senior uniformed officer in the entire United States Army, with authority that reached directly into decisions the Ordnance Department itself had spent years working toward. By 1932, both the Pedersen rifle and John, the competing Garand, had been extensively tested, refined, and reworked, and both were, by that point, chambered in the same .276 caliber, since Garand himself had adapted his own design to compete directly against Pedersen using the same lighter cartridge, a genuine testament to how seriously the .276 concept had been taken across the entire ordnance testing establishment by that stage of the competition. And then the decision came down from above the entire process, and it had almost nothing to do with which rifle actually performed better. The United States, in 1932, was in the deepest trough of the Great Depression. Federal budgets across every department had been slashed repeatedly. The Army was operating with a fraction of the funding it had commanded a decade earlier, and against that backdrop, General MacArthur made a decision that prioritized existing ammunition stockpiles and manufacturing infrastructure over the ballistic and engineering merits of either rifle under consideration. The Army already possessed enormous quantities of .30-06 ammunition built up over more than 2 decades of standardization on that caliber, along with the manufacturing tooling, the depot infrastructure, and the institutional familiarity that came with it. Adopting a new .276 caliber rifle, however genuinely superior its engineering, would have meant retooling the entire ammunition production and logistics chain during a period when the federal government could barely fund its existing military obligations, let alone an expensive and disruptive caliber transition. MacArthur ordered the Ordnance Department to abandon the .276 caliber entirely and standardize any new semi-automatic rifle on the existing .30-06 round instead. That single instruction did not simply disadvantage the Pedersen rifle, it effectively ended it. The entire design Pedersen had built, the toggle lock mechanism, the feeding geometry, the overall dimensions of the rifle, had been engineered as an integrated system built specifically around the particular characteristics of the .276 cartridge, forcing the design to accommodate the larger, more powerful .30-06 round instead was not a simple caliber swap. It fundamentally undermined the specific engineering advantages that had made his integrated rifle and cartridge system compelling in the first place. The design Garand had, by contrast, proved considerably more adaptable to the caliber change, and Springfield Armory redirected its full engineering effort toward reworking the mechanism Garand had around the .30-06 round, a process that ultimately produced the rifle that would be formally adopted in 1936 as the M1 Garand. The rifle Pedersen had built, deprived of the cartridge it had been built around and facing an increasingly consolidated institutional preference within Springfield Armory itself, for the design being developed in-house, rather than the competing design from an outside engineer, faded from serious consideration over the following several years. It is worth being direct about what this decision actually was and was not. It was not a determination that the engineering Pedersen had was inferior. Ordnance officers who had spent years testing both rifles in their original .276 configuration had genuinely divided opinions on relative merit, and a meaningful number favored aspects of the system Pedersen had. It was a budgetary and logistical decision made by an officer whose responsibilities extended across the entire army rather than narrowly into rifle design that prioritized the immense practical cost of a caliber change during the worst economic crisis the country had ever faced over the specific engineering question of which rifle was genuinely better. That is a defensible institutional decision in the abstract. It is also, unambiguously, the reason John Pedersen never got to see his integrated rifle and cartridge system carried by American soldiers into the largest war in human history, a war his design was specifically, deliberately engineered to help fight. Here is what actually distinguished the two designs, and here is what the caliber decision specifically cost the system Pedersen had. The Pedersen rifle used a toggle locking action, a mechanism related conceptually to the toggle lock found in the Luger pistol, though implemented quite differently in the design Pedersen had. The action relied on a lubricated cartridge case to function reliably, a detail that drew genuine and reasonable engineering criticism at the time, since a lubricated round performing correctly in a controlled range environment raised legitimate questions about reliability under the mud, dust, and sand of actual battlefield conditions. This is a fair, technical criticism of the design Pedersen had, and this channel will not pretend otherwise simply because the rifle was ultimately treated unfairly by the caliber decision. Real engineering trade-offs existed on both sides of this competition, but the integrated cartridge Pedersen built specifically for his rifle addressed a genuine limitation in American infantry rifle doctrine that the .30-06, a round originally optimized for a bolt-action rifle and for engagement doctrines dating back to 1906, had never been designed to solve. The .276 Pedersen round was lighter, generated meaningfully less recoil in sustained semi-automatic fire, and allowed a soldier to carry a greater quantity of ammunition for the same total carried weight, a genuinely significant tactical consideration for an infantryman whose combat effectiveness depends heavily on ammunition supply during sustained engagement. Reduced recoil in a semi-automatic rifle is not a minor consideration. It directly affects the ability of a soldier to maintain accurate follow-up shots, manage the physical fatigue of extended firing, and control the weapon effectively across a full day of combat rather than a single controlled range session. The decision Garand himself made to initially chamber his competing design in the same .276 cartridge rather than the existing .30-06 reflects the fact that Garand himself, along with a considerable body of ordnance testing opinion, recognized genuine merit in the lighter caliber concept independent of whose rifle ultimately carried it. When the decision MacArthur had forced both designs back onto the .30-06 round, the practical consequences differed significantly between the two rifles, specifically because of how each had been engineered from the outset. The Garand mechanism, an entirely different locking system built around a rotating bolt rather than the toggle Pedersen had lock, adapted to the larger, more powerful cartridge with considerably fewer fundamental redesign requirements. The toggle Pedersen had lock action, by contrast, had been specifically optimized around the pressure and dimensional characteristics of the lighter .276 round, and adapting it to reliably handle the substantially more powerful 30-06 round introduced exactly the kind of fundamental mechanical strain that toggle lock actions, as a category of design, are generally less well suited to absorb compared to a rotating bolt system. In practical terms, this meant the caliber change did not simply inconvenience the design Pedersen had, it attacked the specific mechanical foundation his entire system had been built upon, while leaving the fundamentally Garand had different mechanical approach considerably better positioned to absorb the same forced transition. This is worth stating with full technical honesty rather than simple partisan sympathy for the underdog. It is entirely possible, and a fair reading of the available historical record supports, that the rotating Garand had bolt mechanism was always the more robust and more readily adaptable foundational design, independent of the caliber question entirely, and that the M1 Garand, which eventually emerged from this process, chambered in the powerful and proven 30-06 round, was a genuinely excellent infantry rifle that served American soldiers exceptionally well across the entire Second World War. What is being argued in this video is not that the rifle Pedersen had would necessarily have outperformed the Garand in actual combat, a question that can never be definitively answered, since the Pedersen system, as originally engineered, was never fielded in the caliber it was built for. What is being argued is that the caliber decision itself was made for reasons entirely unrelated to comparative combat performance, and that decision specifically and disproportionately disadvantaged one of the two competing designs before either rifle ever had the chance to prove itself on genuinely equal footing. Here is what the decision actually meant, both for the man who made the rifle and for the broader history of American small arms development. For John Pedersen personally, the 1932 decision effectively ended his central role in American military rifle design at the peak of his professional career. He had spent years developing an integrated rifle and cartridge system that a meaningful portion of the ordnance testing establishment considered genuinely excellent engineering, and he watched that work rendered largely obsolete by a decision made for reasons that had nothing to do with the engineering itself. He continued working in firearms design afterward, including further work for private industry, but he never again occupied the central position in American military rifle development that he had held through the 1920s and early 1930s, and the rifle that represented the fullest expression of his engineering philosophy, an integrated weapon system rather than simply a mechanism adapted to an inherited cartridge, never saw production or combat service in any form. For the broader trajectory of American infantry weapons, the consequences are more subtle and, in some respects, more significant than a single disappointment in the career of one engineer, however real that disappointment was. The United States entered the Second World War with an infantry rifle chambered in a cartridge originally designed in 1906 for a bolt-action rifle and a doctrine of aimed, deliberate fire at extended range, a doctrine that had already begun shifting substantially by the 1940s toward closer range, higher volume infantry engagement, where a lighter, faster handling cartridge might have offered genuine tactical advantages. The .276 concept that Pedersen had championed, and that Garand himself had initially pursued independently, anticipated a shift in infantry rifle doctrine that the American military would not fully embrace until decades later, when intermediate cartridges finally became standard across NATO forces in the post-war era. In other words, the caliber debate that MacArthur settled through budgetary necessity in 1932 was, in a meaningful sense, the same fundamental debate the American military would revisit repeatedly across the following half-century, through the development of the M14, the eventual adoption of the 5.56 caliber, and the ongoing tension throughout modern infantry rifle development between raw individual cartridge power and the practical tactical advantages of a lighter, higher capacity round. Pedersen was arguing for a version of that same tactical logic in 1928, more than 2 decades before the broader American military establishment began taking the intermediate cartridge concept seriously again. That does not mean the 30-06-chambered M1 Garand was a poor rifle. It was not. It performed exceptionally well across every theater of the Second World War and earned its legendary reputation honestly through genuine combat performance over years of sustained use by millions of American soldiers. But the specific path that led to the Garand becoming that rifle rather than a lighter, 276-chambered alternative built around principles the American military would eventually adopt anyway decades later, was decided by a calculation an officer made about Depression-era ammunition costs, not by a definitive engineering judgment that the 30-06 route was tactically superior. The soldiers who carried the M1 Garand across North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific carried an excellent rifle. What this story asks is simply whether they might have carried an even better one, built around engineering principles the army itself would eventually validate, had a single budgetary decision in the depths of the Great Depression gone differently. So who was actually right? General MacArthur was not wrong about the immediate practical constraint he was managing. The United States government in 1932 genuinely couldn't afford an expensive, disruptive transition to an entirely new rifle caliber, with all of the retooling, retraining, and logistics restructuring that transition would have required in the depths of the worst economic collapse the country had ever experienced. That is a real, legitimate institutional constraint, and pretending otherwise would do this story no favors. But John Peterson was right about something more fundamental and more enduring than any single budget cycle, which is that the infantry rifle cartridge doctrine the American military had inherited from 1906 was already becoming outdated by the standards of modern combat, and that a lighter, faster handling round built specifically for a semi-automatic rifle offered genuine tactical advantages. The 30-06, however proven and however reliable, simply could not match. The United States military would spend the next several decades slowly, expensively, and repeatedly rediscovering exactly that principle through the M14 program, through the eventual NATO standardization debates, and ultimately through the widespread adoption of intermediate cartridges that Pedersen had been arguing for, in essence, since the late 1920s. He was not owed a guaranteed adoption. Engineering competitions are not won simply by being conceptually correct decades ahead of institutional consensus, but he was owed a fair evaluation on the actual engineering merits, uncomplicated by a budget decision made for reasons entirely separate from which rifle performed better, and that is precisely the evaluation the 1932 caliber decision denied him. The M1 Garand remains, by any honest measure, one of the finest and most historically significant infantry rifles ever fielded by any nation, and nothing in this story diminishes the genuine achievement John Garand and Springfield Armory delivered to American soldiers across the Second World War. That achievement is real, and it deserves to be honored on its own considerable merits. But John Pedersen deserves to be remembered too, not as the loser in a simple engineering contest he lost fairly on the merits, but as a designer whose central insight about the future of the infantry rifle cartridge was validated by history itself, decades after one calculation made by a wartime budget officer ended his chance to prove it on the only ground that would have actually settled the question, a genuine and equal trial between his complete integrated system and the design Garand built in the caliber each was actually designed for. The best rifle America had for the war that was coming may well have existed, on paper and on a testing range, in the years just before that war began. It never got the chance to prove it, not because it failed a test, but because the country that needed it could not, in the depths of the Great Depression, afford to find out for certain. There is a particular kind of historical injustice in that outcome, distinct from the more common story this channel usually tells of a company deliberately cheating a craftsman for profit. Nobody profited from what happened to Pedersen. No executive grew rich off his misfortune. The decision that ended his rifle was made by a man managing an honest, brutal constraint, doing what he genuinely believed was the responsible thing for an army that could not afford to gamble on an expensive transition during the worst economic collapse in American history. And that is precisely what makes the story worth telling. Not every betrayal in the history of American arms involves a villain counting money. Sometimes the engineering simply loses to the calendar, to the economy, to the sheer bad luck of arriving at the wrong moment in history with the right idea, and the men who lose that way deserve to be remembered exactly as clearly as the ones who were cheated on purpose.